Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to bioscience.oxfordjournals.org. And before we get into today's show, I wanted to take just a second to once again mention AIBS's Communications Training Bootcamp for Scientists, which is in December. The idea behind the program is it will help scientists translate their findings for a wide variety of audiences, policymakers, reporters, etc. You can learn more and reserve a space at io.aibs.org/bootcamp. And for today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Rachel Gittman, who's a postdoctoral research associate at Northeastern University. She's here to talk to us about shoreline hardening, the installation of human-made structures to protect against floods, erosion, and other coastal threats. We had a lot to chat about, so let's get straight to the interview. Dr. Gittman, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, and before we get into your analysis in particular, I was hoping you could give us just a general overview of shoreline hardening. What is it, and why do people harden shorelines?
Okay, so shoreline hardening is a term that's used broadly to describe any time that we put an artificial structure or an engineered structure on the shore, so something that's man-made, with the intent to provide some kind of protection, whether it's to reduce erosion from wave energy or even to potentially reduce flooding during a storm event when you're talking about some of the larger structures. And some examples of shoreline hardening would be concrete seawalls that you might see along an ocean coastline in the U.S. and elsewhere. You can also see groins, jetties, which are shore perpendicular, typically rock structures that are used to trap sand, usually on beaches. And then you also can see hard structures like breakwaters or sills that can be made of a variety of materials, but are often made of rock or concrete that are typically shore parallel, but offshore, and their intent is to break waves and dissipate that energy before it even hits the shore. So all of those types of structures are considered some form of shoreline hardening. And as I said before, it's really just to protect typically human infrastructure, so houses or private property or utility lines, roads, from some kind of damage associated with coastal storms or from just general erosive activities.
Okay, and just as sort of a general matter, how often are shorelines hardened? Is this a very common practice?
So it is relatively common. It's something that happens over throughout the world. So a lot of your major metropolitan areas are going to have a significant amount of hardening. So some of the work on shoreline hardening has come out of Australia, specifically out of Sydney. They have a lot of major seawalls. Japan has just miles and miles, or kilometers if you think in those terms, of shoreline that have large seawalls to protect from tsunamis and also from just storm events. And then in the U.S., it's relatively common as well. The estimate that I was able to come up with in a recent analysis was 14% of the continental U.S.'s shoreline is hardened, and that is the equivalent of 22,000 kilometers of shoreline. So the 14% may not seem that common, but 22,000 kilometers is a pretty significant number.
And is this expected to increase? I always wind up asking in every single one of these interviews at some point a question about climate change and possibly rising sea levels. But are hardened shorelines something we should expect to see more of in the future?
Well, I think it depends on how we choose to manage our shorelines in the future. If we go with the status quo and do things the way we are currently doing them, then I would say yes. We would expect to see more hardening because people are not moving away from the coast in most places. They're moving towards the coast. People want to live by the water for recreation, and also just because there is typically a lot of industry going on along the coastlines. There's major ports, there's lots of tourism, and so there's job opportunities. So we definitely expect more development associated with that increase in population. And with development comes the need to protect those structures from damage from storms or just other activities. So if we allow that development and then we allow the subsequent hardening, then we would expect, in my opinion, for hardening to continue to increase.
Okay, and so we've talked about the upside of shoreline hardening, which is that it protects these human-built structures. But what kind of downsides are we looking at, just as sort of a general matter?
So some of the downsides that have been observed, not just by my colleagues and I that have worked on this issue, but other people, including other disciplines like engineers, is that depending on how you design the structure, you can have loss of shoreline adjacent to that structure, or even in front of that structure. So if your goal is to, say, protect property landward of a seawall that you put in, a concrete seawall, and you've put it in, and there's a lawn and someone's house behind it, that seawall might prevent erosion of that land. But because of the shore dynamics, the wave energy, the geomorphology of the shoreline seaward of that structure, you may lose your intertidal beach or your shallow vegetated habitat if there's a marsh in front of that seawall or bulkhead. So there's a trade-off with a lot of hardening techniques. Another example would be groins and jetties, or again, these are structures that are shore perpendicular, and so they're trapping sand as the longshore currents move down the coast, and as those currents move down the coast, they bring sand and sediment with it. And so if you're trapping sand and sediment on one side of a structure, you're obviously starving it on the other side of the structure. And so one person may accumulate shoreline while their neighbor might lose shoreline. So that's one downside, just from a pure physical perspective.
I actually had a question about the jetty structure, because that's something I'd not encountered before. So it's, if you had, say, a current that was moving just on the east coast of the United States, northward, say, that current would be depositing sediment at some point. But if you had a jetty that jutted out into the water, it would stop the deposition north of the jetty?
In theory, yeah. I mean, it depends on how long the jetty is. So sometimes the current, if it's a short jetty, the current might be strong enough that it's not redirected so much that the current slows down enough for that sediment to drop out of the current. So these particles are being carried, in the water column, and once they settle out, that's where they're being deposited. So if you have a strong enough current and a short enough jetty, you may not lose all of the sand as it's rerouted around that jetty. It really just depends on the specific site conditions. But a lot of places, I mean, you can look at this on Google Earth. You can look along the coast and you can see these shore perpendicular structures, and you see these lopsided shorelines where all of the sand is piled up on one side of a structure and then it's scoured out on the other side. And if you have a series of these structures along the shore, it'll be a patchwork, of shorelines that are robust and then scoured out. And that's kind of a domino effect. Your neighbor puts in a jetty, you may put one in because you want to trap sand to try to restore your shoreline, and so on.
So you wind up with a little bit of a tragedy of the commons type of situation where your neighbor's hardening a shoreline area causes you to want to do the same to protect against it.
Yeah, exactly. I have a colleague at Northeastern who's actually published on that topic in Alabama, not with groins and jetties, but on bulkheads. They did a series of surveys of homeowners and essentially found that what their neighbor did influenced what they did in terms of their shore protection. If their neighbor had a bulkhead, they were much more likely to have a bulkhead. So there is this tragedy of the commons, I think, occurring in a lot of coastlines.
That's very interesting. And now I was hoping we could move on to your meta-analysis. So you were looking at some work that's previously been done on hardened shorelines and their effects. Could you tell us a little bit about the studies that you included?
Yeah, so I was really focused on trying to understand the ecological effects. So we've talked a little bit about just the pure physical effects that you may be losing sediment. Well, associated with a loss of that sediment or a loss of a shallow beach or an intertidal beach is also potentially the loss of the organisms that are depending on that sediment or on that larger beach area for forage or refuge, some kind of habitat. And so I am more of an ecologist than I am an engineer or a geologist. And so I really wanted to look at studies that evaluated the biodiversity, so some kind of index of the number of species, so species richness, or the number and abundance of individuals within a species, like Shannon diversity indices, for shorelines that had been hardened versus shorelines that were in their natural state. And the hardened shorelines I grouped into three categories, which we've talked about a little bit. So the bulkheads and seawalls being one category, riprap revetments, which are these rocky structures that are placed in the same place that a bulkhead or seawall would. It's just that it's a big pile of rocks or concrete, not just a vertical wall. And then the other category would be breakwaters and sills, which are these shore parallel structures that are offshore, and they're breaking the waves. But again, they're made of these rock piles essentially, or some other material piled up. And then these were each compared to whatever natural shoreline was in the area where the study was done. So it could have been a rocky shore, it could have been a marsh, it could have been sand beach or a mud flat, but all of those were included. And so essentially any study done that was peer-reviewed and published globally was included in the analysis if it made that comparison for either biodiversity or just had some measure of an abundance of marine organisms in the study. And then if those data were actually available within the publication, like they actually reported the numbers in a way that I could pull them out of the paper and include them in a quantitative analysis.
Okay, and what did you find from those studies? Were some forms of shore hardening better than others, and how did they compare with natural shorelines?
So for the analysis, I tried to focus on just comparing the hardened shoreline to the natural shoreline, as opposed to comparing across shoreline types, comparing bulkheads to breakwaters, just because they often aren't in the same location. But you can draw some conclusions based on their performance relative to their natural counterpart in terms of ranking those structures. And what I found is that seawalls and bulkheads, so these vertical walls, when compared to natural shorelines, they had lower biodiversity of marine organisms associated with them, and they also had a lower abundance of marine organisms. And this is across different groups of organisms, from shorebirds to fish and crustaceans, all the way down to the small crustaceans and bivalves that are occupying the sediments or are encrusting on a rocky shoreline.
And just out of curiosity, what's the downside of having those lower biodiversity numbers? Is this going to affect things like local fisheries or other ecosystem services, anything along those lines?
Well, yeah, it can have an effect. So when you have a lower biodiversity, you have fewer species, and you also may have fewer numbers of individual species, and each of those species may be serving a unique function in that ecosystem, or it may be redundant. But if you have any other stressors that come in and say are affecting other species, there's no overall buffer for maintaining that ecosystem function. So if you have two bivalve species naturally occurring in your community, and shoreline hardening knocks one of them out, and then maybe poor water quality knocks the other one out, then you have no bivalves in your community. And those bivalves will provide a lot of services. So they may be food for fish or crustaceans, and those fish and crustaceans may be commercially or recreationally valuable. They are also likely filtering out pollutants and toxins from terrestrial runoff, so your water quality might further degrade. And they are just overall providing some structural heterogeneity for the ecosystem. So those bivalves are often reforming, or they maybe just have some kind of complex habitat structure associated with them, and that's habitat for other organisms. So species are dependent on one another, and so if you have more biodiversity, you typically have a more robust, well-functioning system than if you have a lower biodiversity.
And were there differences between the different types of hardened shoreline and the effects that they showed?
Yeah, so I spoke about the seawalls already. So seawalls and bulkheads were the only type of structure that showed a difference. So they were, had lower biodiversity and abundance. than the other structure types. But the riprap, revetments, and then the breakwaters and sills, we didn't see a difference between those structures and natural shorelines. And there's a couple different reasons that we could see this. So one just could be simply that we had fewer studies on these types of structures, so our power to detect differences wasn't as high as it was for seawalls and bulkheads. So that's one potential explanation, is that we just didn't simply have enough studies to determine if there was truly a difference. Another explanation could be that there truly is no difference between these structures in terms of their habitat provision. So they're providing the same refuge as a natural shoreline. And then the other explanation could simply be that for each organism group affected, these structures have varying responses. So unlike seawalls and bulkheads, where it seems to be a net negative for all organism groups, for breakwaters and sills and for riprap, it may be that only fish and crustaceans are affected positively, while vegetative shorelines, so the plants that are occupying the shorelines like marsh or mangrove species, are negatively affected. And so we saw hints of that in our analysis, but we weren't able to conclusively say which one of those explanations was the most likely.
So on that latter point, I'm thinking about this from, my own local shoreline, and we have some stone breakwaters that are out in the water, and they are covered with oysters. So it could be a case where, the oysters are doing relatively well in that area and perhaps are aided by the presence of the breakwaters. But the grass species that seem to inhabit a lot of the other parts of the shoreline that don't have those breakwaters are being killed off.
Exactly. So that's one thing that we have seen this in some studies that have come out recently. Even since I finished this analysis, I had a colleague send me a paper showing some negative effects of riprap on seagrass, and it's because of this wave reflection. So this riprap is typically put landward of seagrass, and if the seagrass is shallow enough and close enough to that riprap, it's possible that when the waves come in, they're reflecting off of the riprap and scouring out the seagrass. So there's definitely evidence out there that these structures are going to affect some groups of organisms very differently than others. Fish, on the other hand, and oysters, encrusting organisms, all seem to like these rocky structures because there's lots of crevices and cracks for them to hide in. The oysters are able to attach not just along a vertical wall where they might get exposed directly to all of the wave energy and all the predation, but they could actually encrust, on the lower side of a rock and get some protection. So the benefits for, some fauna are going to be, very different than, say, the consequences for other organisms.
Okay, so we've talked about one of the potential effects, or one of the ways in which the hardened shoreline could, negatively affect biodiversity in the revetments. But how does that work with, for instance, seawalls? What's the mechanism that could be causing the lower species diversity there?
So I don't think there's any one mechanism. I think there's multiple, and I am drawing mainly from some of my own work, but also the conclusions of the authors whose studies I included. And a lot of this is speculation, because until you actually go out and experimentally, test these mechanisms, you can't be certain that these are the causes. But the general list that we've kind of come up with is, one, you have this issue of wave energy reflection. So a vertical wall is not absorbing any of the wave energy when a wave comes to shore. It's reflecting it right back out. And that energy is going to have, or may have an effect on anything that's seaward of that seawall. And so if it's just soft sediments with organisms living in those sediments, it might just increase the overall disturbance of that sediment. That might interfere with benthic infauna feeding in those sediments. It may displace them. It may actually, there may be wave energy that's strong enough to even kill some of those organisms. You have encrusting organisms, as I was saying earlier, like oysters or maybe different types of algae, barnacles. They may foul a seawall and may be able to attach to it, but the environment may be more extreme, again, because that wave energy is coming directly into that seawall and being reflected. And if there were more crevices or cracks, places that those organisms could avoid being in the direct line of that wave, they may have higher, survivorship or growth. They won't spend as much time defending themselves from that energy. There's also this lack of refuge from predation on a vertical wall. There's no place to hide. And this applies to your encrusting organisms, but also your mobile grazers like snails that might be living on a shoreline, and also your smaller fish and crustaceans that would typically crawl into cracks and crevices. So there's physical and biological mechanisms that could explain lower biodiversity on vertical walls, like seawalls and bulkheads, when compared to natural shorelines. But I think they all link back to this very different structure. So a vertical flat wall is not a typical characteristic of a natural shoreline, any kind of shoreline. Rocky shores tend to have a lot of heterogeneity. There has lots of crevices and cracks and boulders. Soft sediments are generally more gently sloping, and organisms can hide in the sediment. And then your vegetated shorelines, there's obviously a lot of places to hide and to get away from some of your larger environmental stressors like wave energy or exposure to air, for instance.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the problems and some of the potential mechanisms that might underlie lower biodiversity on hardened shorelines, and I think it raises the question then of what do we do? We're probably not going to stop human beings from wanting to build very expensive structures right on the shore. Is there a way to protect those structures that's less environmentally damaging?
So, in my opinion, yes, there are other options, and there's a term that's used to kind of encompass a variety of options, and that's called a living shoreline. This is a term that the federal agencies in the U.S. have largely adopted, and it basically is a term that you could define as any kind of stabilization technique that incorporates some kind of natural component or feature into the technique. So it could be that you just plant marsh vegetation to stabilize an eroding shoreline. Like that would be the most natural type of living shoreline that you have. Or you could restore an oyster reef by putting loose oyster shell down. And then maybe but maybe that's not enough. Maybe you're in a higher energy environment and so you need a little bit more protection. Well, then you would maybe include that marsh planting, maybe do some oyster restoration, but also put an offshore rock sill in place so that you have both a living and an engineered component in your design. And then you can go all the way to, the most extreme, which would be, really large, maybe rock breakwaters, and then some planting in your highest energy environment. Some people even say, well, if you had to put in some seawalls, but you also put in marsh vegetation, in some ways that's kind of a living shoreline as well. But typically, most people are going towards the breakwaters and the sills as the hard component they're incorporating in these living shoreline designs because they don't sever the connection between the upland and the intertidal environment, which is what often causes the scouring of those marine habitats and the loss of those marine habitats. That's something we worry about with climate change and sea level rise.
Okay, and I'm curious, what level are these decisions being made at? Are these local city decisions? Are they state decisions, federal government decisions, landowner decisions? I mean, I'm sure it gets pretty complicated in there.
It's very complicated, and they're actually made at all levels. So, first, an individual property owner has to decide that they want to do something about their shoreline. They want to change it. And if they decide they want to change it and they want to put in some kind of structure, in most states, they have to have some kind of permit at the state level. And then there is a permitting process at the federal level. And then sometimes there's actually a permitting process at the local town or community level. And this as with, so many of our laws in the U.S., this varies from state to state. But the Army Corps of Engineers is the primary federal permitting authority for shoreline stabilization structures. So they also build a lot of the large structures we see on like public property, and a lot of the big groins and jetties you might see. They also build the dikes and levees along the Mississippi, but they also permit them for private landowners. And so, it's a very complicated process, and every state has their own way of handling the federal-state joint review of these permits.
And so, the objective, I guess, then would be to sort of try to nudge these various stakeholders in the direction of using more naturalistic structures, or at the very least, using fewer seawalls and bulkheads.
Yeah, and so there have been many, many, many people moving in that direction from the federal agency perspective, also from nonprofit organizations, environmental groups, restoration groups, and then also individual academics have been trying to tackle this issue at each level. So there's been a lot of work to try to educate landowners, to educate marine contractors, your coastal engineering firms. I've been part of some of these coastal training programs in North Carolina where we invite marine contractors and coastal engineers and real estate developers to these trainings, and we tell them about alternatives to bulkheads and seawalls. We present the data on their performance and also on the ecological benefits of living shorelines relative to hardened shorelines. So that's kind of the grassroots movement. There's then the state level where, depending on what state you're in, there's been pressure to make it easier to get a living shoreline, because the permitting process for these living shorelines is often complicated because it's relatively new. And so a lot of state agencies are uncomfortable permitting them the same way they would a bulkhead. A bulkhead is something they're familiar with. A living shoreline, they're not. And so they often want to take more time to review that living shoreline. And that can be a disincentive for a landowner. And then finally, at the federal level, the Army Corps of Engineers actually has to renew their nationwide permits every 5 years. And they were up for renewal this year. And they introduced a new nationwide permit for living shorelines because prior to this year, they did not have an appropriate nationwide permit to apply to living shorelines. They didn't really fall cleanly within any of the existing permits. And so this meant a longer permitting process for those types of structures compared to a bulkhead or a seawall.
And I can imagine, local city officials, state officials, or landowners, thinking about the next hurricane season and, wanting to get something in place as soon as they possibly could.
Exactly. And it costs money. Most permits have a fee associated with them. So it's not just a time, but also a cost issue. And then the other complexity is finding, a contractor or engineer who is willing to do a living shoreline. Many homeowners will just look up a local contractor and they'll ask the contractor, what should I do? And if the contractor is used to doing bulkheads, they're going to say you should put in a bulkhead. And so we really are trying hard to get to the coastal engineers and to the marine contractors and say, look, this is something you can offer your homeowners and still make money. And it's not as complicated or as scary as it seems. But it's a slow process. People take time to accept change.
Of course. And what sort of organizations do the outreach to those contractors? You mentioned that you were a part of one.
Yeah, so in North Carolina, the North Carolina Division of Coastal Management is actually, the state agency has actually put on a lot of these trainings in association with NOAA and also with the help of some local NGOs. So the North Carolina Coastal Federation is a restoration group and an advocate for living shorelines, and they've been heavily involved in the slow march towards living shorelines. And so all of those groups have been involved in these training sessions. And we're hoping that we can continue them in the future. They're often funded by small grants, either through the state or the federal government. And so continue the program year to year, you have to kind of continue to reapply for funding for these kinds of programs.
So it sounds like on the wider level, you have a situation in which the technology is there to do this in a less ecologically impactful way. There's motivation there, at least at some levels, and it's just a matter of getting everybody caught up and ready to do it.
Yeah, and it's an issue where living shorelines are not intended to replace other types of shore stabilization everywhere. There's still plenty of places where a bulkhead or a seawall are going to be appropriate. If you have a large port where you're going to have large ships coming in and they need to have a smooth vertical wall to dock against, you're not going to put a living shoreline in there. But it's really this idea that we need to move towards environmentally preferable solutions in places where they are where they make sense. And so to do that, we need people to kind of move away from what is just easiest or what they've always done to maybe something that might be a little more uncertain in their eyes, but that really can provide a lot more ecological benefits in the long term.
One question I often asked is, what's next for your research? What are you looking at right now, and what should we expect to look for in the future?
So I'm kind of moving in a lot of different directions. As a postdoc, I'm actually working on projects that are totally unrelated to shoreline hardening. I'm working on some population modeling of Atlantic cod right now. I'm also part of a working group that's looking at how we fund at the federal level coastal restoration in the United States. That's the project I'm currently funded to do. So somewhat related, but not really living shoreline specific or hardening specific. But I'm not able to completely escape the living shoreline hardening world. I'm actually working with a graduate student now who's doing some follow-up work to some of the work that I did when I was a PhD student. I had looked at performance of different structures during a major hurricane, and she's gone back and revisited my sites during another hurricane and then over another period of time. And so I'm working with her to kind of build a larger data set on the performance of these structures. So that's kind of ongoing. And then I'm also working with a colleague, Stephen Cyphers, who's a new faculty at Northeastern, to get into more of the socioeconomic issues. So we've been doing some surveys of private property owners to try to understand, what drives their decision-making process. And he's been doing this in Alabama, Florida, the Northeast. I've largely focused in North Carolina. And so over the next couple of years, we hope to have a better understanding of, the decision-making, the economics behind these choices, so that we can know where best to focus in terms of changing what people choose to do.
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, I think that about wraps up my set of questions. Is there anything else that you'd expected to talk about on the podcast that you haven't had a chance to get to that I've failed to ask you about?
No, I guess I just would want to say that this has definitely not been a sole effort. I've had a lot of great colleagues working with me on this topic, and I've had a lot of support from all sectors, from private waterfront homeowners who are just interested in doing something different, all the way to the NGOs and to the government agencies and also academia. So I'm just really very excited to be part of something that seems to be going across disciplines and across groups of people and bringing everybody together to try to address a complex but really important issue.
And that seems like a great place to leave it. Dr. Gittman, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.